It's called The Greatest Lie Told During COVID, and the one they will undoubtedly try to tell again. So the lie is, as Gato Malo argues in this piece, pandemics are dangerous to modern societies. Now that's going to sound like an extraordinary thing to call a lie, isn't it? How could they not be? We all know of pandemics like the one we are supposedly still living in, and the Spanish flu, and how completely dangerous they are. But he lays it out, and I'm going to lay out some of it. And again, I recommend that you read the piece, but let's just lay out a few of the pieces here. What do we actually know? Well, one of actually before I lay it out in an organized way, one of the past pandemics of the last 100 years that he points to is the Hong Kong flu in 1968-69, which I had actually not heard of, except that we were both born in 1969, and your mother actually had it when she was pregnant with you.
That's right.
Right, and
which may explain everything.
It may explain everything, absolutely. Yeah. But it was pretty bad. People were taking it very seriously, and yet what happened near the end, or in the middle of the Hong Kong flu, so-called Hong Kong flu, being one of the worst pandemics in America? Well, Woodstock happened, right? Instead of the response that we had during COVID, which is shut down everything and instill fear in the hearts and minds of everyone that you can possibly instill fear in, that's a terrible way to put it, but the American government and the American people apparently never considered, or if they ever considered, it never got past some very small meetings doing anything like disrupting society at the level that has happened during COVID. Woodstock happened, one of the greatest known public displays of sort of human ecstasis in the 20th century, right? So. And what happened? Gosh, well, Woodstock, that's got to have been a super spreader event. Well, no, it was fine, right? It was fine. So similarly, as I was reading this piece, sort of before I lay out his argument, he mentioned Zika, which was a virus that shows up in South America as something that causes, if I remember correctly, microencephaly in babies born to mothers who were exposed to Zika while they were pregnant. And we were about to go on our 11-week study abroad with 30 students, half of whom were women and all of whom were of reproductive age. And we felt compelled, we felt honor bound, and that it was required of us to talk carefully with all of them about what we could tell about this new emerging pathogen, what the risks were to them, and to advise that if any of them were actually thinking of getting pregnant, becoming mothers anytime soon, they should maybe consider not going. That it was, that there seemed to be some kind of a latency, and it was this emerging virus we didn't know, but it was our obligation to talk about what that was, and it seemed like it might be something that would take over the world, and then it fizzled, right? Like people just stopped talking about it at some point after some number of months, and this, in part, is the argument that Gato Malo is making, that these mostly these pandemics that we are told to be terrified of, if there is no big governmental response, they tend to burn themselves out. So
can I fill that in a little bit?
Yeah.
You're going to do it.
About to, yeah. That respiratory pathogens almost never cause pandemics in the modern era, basically since penicillin. That penicillin and other antibiotics, depending on what the pathogen is, have done a fantastic job of controlling the kinds of things that might once have actually done widespread fast damage in human populations. And that is even when they appear to, because maybe you want to jump in here before I get into the public policy measures.
So effectively, the argument is that there is a trade-off. Things that spread highly effectively aren't highly pathogenic or highly virulent. And so the point is, yes, things can spread across civilization. A respiratory virus, though, requires you to, as we've talked about many times on DarkHorse, it requires you to be up and about in order to do the spreading, and therefore it can't make you all that sick, which means it's not likely to be all that deadly. There are diseases that are exceptions, but they have other modes of transmission. And so
just to fill that in, if you do not transmit directly if the pathogen doesn't go from host to host, but uses a vector to get between you. Something that is malaria, that is mosquito-borne, for instance, mosquito vector diseases like malaria, like yellow fever, like West Nile, like dengue, may actually benefit from making its host sick enough to be non-mobile, such that mosquitoes are better able to find hosts and then carry them to other not yet infected potential hosts.
Not only not able to move around, but, let's take dengue.
Yeah.
The colloquial name, breakbone fever.
Yeah.
The reason, because of the profound pain in the bones it happens after a person's been infected a second time by dengue. So this is a complex phenomenon that involves somebody who already has immunity, which the pathogen then utilizes. But anyway, the point is, your bones feel like they're broken. Well, you're not very good at swatting mosquitoes, even if if you're lying flat, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, some pathogens can be profoundly debilitating and very dangerous. And dengue, the second time you get it, is one of these pathogens. But
and at least one of the species of malaria, of which there are 4, right? These diseases can
they
kill
can
you.
be very, very, very,
And they can kill you and still
destructive.
win at being the disease at being the pathogen that they are that causes the disease. Whereas if you don't have a vector or some other mechanism by which to spread, making your host very, very, very sick so that they can't go out and infect other people is an evolutionary dead end for the pathogen. And so pathogens that do that won't persist.
Yeah. The other thing to say, and this is proper context, we've been fed an overly simplistic model of all kinds of things, including the damage that comes from pathogens for this entire pandemic. Mm-hmm. One of the things that happens, even if you had a comparatively high case fatality rate, in large measure, what's happening is it's pulling deaths that would occur soon, so they happen sooner than they might. But the idea that we've been sold is that somebody's life was lost, and that's not the right way to think about it. It's how many years of life were lost, right?
So you might actually be able to see that if you look at excess mortality for 5 years before through 10 years after.
Exactly.
And see if you have less than expected afterwards, because some number of people have already died a year, 2, 3 years before they might have.
That is exactly right. So anyway, it's not a simple calculation. And also, if you were doing something like comparing unknown harms from a transfection agent, an untried gene therapy, and a disease with an unknown risk to human life, if the risk is to young people, then the number of years lost for every life lost is huge. Yeah. Right? Whereas when somebody is dying of COVID and they are at their life expectancy or beyond it, they're losing very few years. And these things it's not a difficult thing to calculate the amount of loss. We just refuse to do it because something wanted us to think these were deaths as if these people were going to live forever, absent the virus, when in fact what mostly happened was people who were very old or quite sick had some years potentially lost, but not a huge number.
So the argument continues. Again, this is in the Bad Catitude Substack piece that I will link to, that many public policy measures like lockdowns, and although this wasn't a public policy measure, this was a widespread medical measure, particularly in some places like New York, the use of ventilators, lockdowns, ventilators, did more harm than good. And many, if not most of, if not maybe even the vast majority of COVID deaths during COVID are attributable to what Brett was just talking about with regard to hastening the demise of someone who was already near the end of their life, which doesn't make it a wonderful thing to have happened, but it's less tragic than when a child dies or a young person dies. But even, if we look at 2020, before the transfection agents, before the so-called vaccines were trotted out, at which point we have other reasons to consider what excess deaths are about. The argument laid out here is that many of the harms, many of the excess deaths and other injuries that people were experiencing were iatrogenic. And iatrogenic means, and I'm just going to read exactly the definition that he writes in his book, is relating in his Substack, relating to illness caused by medical examination or treatment. So if what we have are largely harms caused not by the pathogen, but by the treatment brought on in order to treat the pathogen, then certainly it could have been avoided. And there's a lot of evidence that comes in a variety of forms in this piece, including, for instance, that Sweden, which almost uniquely in the West, responded very quickly, very early in a couple of ways, but then mostly just let its society be. And a lot of people in the West were confused. I mean, I was confused. It's like, wow, that's amazing. What are they doing? I would have expected Sweden and all the rest of the Scandinavian countries to be doing sort of what the U.S. is doing, but more so. And the fact is that what they did worked. And what they did was not much. They let society be, right? They let society do what it was supposed to be doing. And specifically, ventilators. In the ventilators, which were widespread in ICUs in New York and not in several other states, correlate. You see extremely high death rates during the period when ventilators were being used on COVID patients in ICUs in New York, and not at the same time controlling for almost everything except the exact location in these other states where ventilators weren't being used. That suggests that the ventilators were the cause, the primary cause, rather than the COVID. You have, of course, sending COVID positive people into care homes, where care homes are already people who are at risk, because of their age, because they are somewhat infirm, because they're not being allowed to go outside, because they're not moving much. You send COVID positive people into care homes, you spread COVID, and some of those people are not going to make it. And keeping people inside rather than letting people go outside and be active and be healthy and make do while the sun shines and do all of the things that we're supposed to be doing outside, of course, was another iatrogenic harm as a result. Iatrogenic harm from during COVID, which can be attributed to not the virus, but the policy in response to the virus. And then we'll talk about Spanish flu in a moment, but you have some things to say.
Yeah, I have a number of things to say here. One, there is a question. The deaths occurred as a result of medical treatment that was a mistake, or it may have been a mistake.
I think the ventilators, for instance.
Yes, the ventilators, for instance, sending sick people to care homes, all of these things had a negative impact.
Well, I was just saying with regard to a mistake. I hope that the ventilator use was a mistake. I cannot fathom how sending sick people into care homes ever made sense.
Yeah, but this is the point I'm going to make.
Okay.
Is the striking thing about our behavior at a medical level during COVID was that we did essentially everything we shouldn't have done and none of the things we should have done.
Right.
People should have been outside. We locked them inside. We took sick people and sent them to places they would infect other vulnerable people. We hooked them up to ventilators. When the ventilators didn't work, we turned up the pressure, right? We denied them drugs that are safe and do work. We gave them things, medical treatments that don't work and cause harm. It's across the board. And I keep trying to call attention to the unlikeliness of you landing on every wrong answer. That's really improbable, right? So I don't know whether that is just a matter of we have a few morons who think upside down and land on the wrong answer all the time, and really all you got to do to find out the right answer is do the opposite of whatever they say. That seems super unlikely, but could be. But the point is, we did all these things. Whatever their nature, they caused a lot of people to die, and then we counted them as COVID deaths.
Yes.
And so the counting them as COVID deaths then amped up the panic.
Help stoke fear.
Right. And the panic then justified the draconian measures that were inflicted on us. So again, I don't know how this worked or why it happened, but Guatemala's point is we inflicted this harm on ourselves. It caused a lot of fear because it created numbers that left the impression of an extremely dangerous virus. Now, of course, you and I believe that the virus is very destructive, but it doesn't have a high case fatality rate.
Right.
And so the fear that it was going to rob us of, our friends and relatives at some high rate was always nonsense. But we created this fictional pathogen that was doing that, and those, had there been a force behind the scenes that had been looking for an excuse to increase its own power to control the behavior of the population, what could be said, where people could go, this became that excuse, and it deployed it at an incredible rate. The other thing from the points you've highlighted so far that I thought was very strong in this piece was it suggests that in some sense, as bad as a disease that's circulating in society is, and I think we underrate the harm of all the things that circulate, but as bad as they are, it may be that the best thing you can do is as little as possible. You can treat the symptoms, you can take basic rational precautions. You
Isolate very sick people.
Yeah, if you're sick, don't make contact with other people, wash your hands, these sorts of things. You can treat acute cases. If you've got a really good, safe drug that seems to prevent transmission, when one person in a household gets it, you could give that drug to the others, and there are all sorts of basic things you could do.
Now, with a new virus, is that the moment to introduce other new medical technology, or is that not the moment?
That's the amazing thing. And the last thing I want to say at this stage in the discussion is we have two basic models of medicine in competition. And I believe that we saw something like a coup unfold by one against the other during the COVID pandemic. Mm-hmm. The coup was by the public health approach to the medical health approach. Mm-hmm. Now, I certainly agree that there are questions to be raised about public health. There are things that happen at the population level that matter that are not best addressed at the personal level. However, personal medical health with respect to illnesses that an individual comes down with are comparatively well addressed from a bottom-up approach. That is to say, doctors seeing patients, discovering what works, what doesn't work, talking with each other, improving their own techniques, pooling their information, right? That system...
But treating patients as individuals,
right?
Not as temporarily disaggregated members of some vague population. Doctors don't treat populations. Doctors treat individuals. And pools of doctors get smarter because a doctor who sees a pattern will discuss that pattern with other doctors who will decide whether they are seeing that pattern and what it might mean. That emergent intelligence grows in medicine. And what has happened here is we have decided instead that what we want is the highest quality information sourced by the people in a position to see the most, who will then hand down the information about the standard of care. And in this case, they handed us every wrong idea there was. Mm-hmm. They did massive harm, whereas they basically they handcuffed the doctors who otherwise would have done much better. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, the comparison between a bottom-up approach, doctors seeing patients and discovering what works, versus a top-down approach where Anthony Fauci tells you what he was given on the tablets on the mountain and this thing, right? There's no comparison between these in terms of how much harm was going to be done. We tried, during COVID, we tried the Anthony Fauci version, and we got an absolutely unmitigated disaster. We got a disaster that we amplified.